At the funeral of the unfortunate man, the pallbearers carelessly dropped the coffin, revealing its contents. Everyone present let out horrified screams as they saw what was inside. "Hugo, did you forget your lunch again?" Rosalia's voice, soft but tinged with a playful reproach, cut through the quiet hum of the early morning. He turned, grinning sheepishly, his tousled dark hair catching the light streaming through the window. "Got it right here," he said, patting the small sack she had packed just moments ago. "Better not waste my effort," she teased, her hazel eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned on the wooden doorframe. "Mom says you're too skinny for someone who's supposed to be helping in the fields all summer." Hugo chuckled, slinging the sack over his shoulder. "Tell your mum I'll fatten up after harvest. Plenty of time before the winter comes." They shared a laugh, the kind of easy, familiar exchange that had marked their years growing up together in the same quiet village. Their bond wasn't something either of them questioned. It simply was, a thread woven into the fabric of their lives. But today, the air felt heavier, the laughter tinged with something unspoken. Hugo and Rosalia had grown up side by side, sharing everything from school desks to dreams whispered under the ancient oak tree by the stream. The villagers often smiled knowingly at their closeness, the older women calling them a pair of young lovebirds, while the men chuckled, saying Hugo would make a good husband for the girl. Neither protested. Why would they? Rosalia hadn't always known she loved him. It wasn't a thunderbolt realization or some grand epiphany. It was quieter than that, like a river wearing down a stone until it finally understood its shape. She noticed it in the way her heart quickened when he smiled at her, or how her day brightened when he brought her wildflowers without a word, just because he could. And Hugo. He was steady, the kind of boy who didn't need to announce his feelings for her to know. His actions spoke for him, helping her carry water buckets, fixing the rickety chair in her kitchen when her mother complained, staying late to make sure she wasn't alone walking home. They didn't say the words. They didn't have to. The plan had always been simple. They'd finish school, get married in the small church at the edge of the village, and move to the city together for college. Rosalia would study teaching. Hugo, something mechanical. He wasn't sure yet, but he'd figure it out. What mattered most was they'd be together, their futures intertwined like the roots of the oak tree they loved so much. Rosalia's mother, ever practical, had even ordered a white lace dress for Rosalia's graduation. "No sense in wasting money twice," she'd said with a wink. "The same dress will do fine for the wedding." Rosalia blushed, protesting half-heartedly, but deep down she'd already pictured herself walking down the aisle in it, Hugo waiting for her at the altar. But dreams have a way of unraveling. It was a warm spring day when Rosalia's mother collapsed in the cow barn. One moment, she was standing there, shooing flies away with her scarf, and the next, she was crumpled on the dirt floor, her breath shallow and rasping. The village doctor came quickly, but not quickly enough. The funeral was quiet, attended by neighbors who brought casseroles and whispered condolences that Rosalia barely heard. She stood by the grave, her hands clenched tightly around Hugo's arm, as if letting go of him would mean falling into the abyss of her grief. "She was all I had," Rosalia whispered that night, her head resting on Hugo's shoulder as they sat on her porch in silence. "You've got me," he said simply, his voice steady and sure, like it always was. And she believed him. The weeks passed, but the loss lingered, casting a long shadow over their plans. Rosalia tried to push forward, focusing on small tasks, mending clothes, preparing meals, tending the small garden behind her house. But each day felt heavier than the last, as if the world had shifted and left her behind. Hugo stayed close, helping her whenever he could, but there was a growing tension in his eyes, something he hadn't yet told her. And then, one evening, he finally did. "They've called me up," he said, his voice low and hesitant. Rosalia's breath caught. "The army?" He nodded. "It's just a year, Rosalia. I'll be back before you know it. We'll pick up where we left off, I swear." She wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the certainty in his voice. But the thought of losing him, even for a little while, felt like the earth shifting under her feet all over again. "You'll write to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every week," he promised, reaching out to take her hand. "And when I'm back, we'll have that wedding, and we'll go to the city just like we planned." She nodded, blinking back tears. "You'd better keep your word, Hugo Reyes." He smiled, a little lopsided, a little sad. "Always." The day he left, Rosalia stood at the edge of the village, watching the dust kick up behind the truck that carried him away. Her hand clutched the small pendant he'd given her the night before, a simple thing but heavy with meaning. "I'll wait for you," she whispered, though there was no one left to hear. Hugo had imagined the army would be a series of endless drills and barking orders, something he could grit his teeth and survive. What he hadn't counted on was the silence, the quiet moments between orders, when the noise settled and his mind had nowhere to go but back to the village, back to Rosalia. At first, the letters came easily. He'd sit on his bunk after a long day, the faint buzz of his comrades' chatter fading into the background, and he'd write to her. The words poured out of him, as natural as breathing. He wrote about the weather, the food, the dull routines, and always about how much he missed her. Each letter was sealed with promises that he'd be home before she even noticed he was gone, that their plans for the city would still hold, that nothing could change how he felt about her. But as the months dragged on, the letters started to come slower, the words harder to find. It wasn't that he didn't think of her. He thought of her constantly. But life in the army had a way of grinding down even the most steadfast resolve. His world became smaller, consumed by the immediate demands of survival and camaraderie. Rosalia, back in the village, read every letter as though it were scripture. She'd sit by the window in the evenings, the faint glow of the oil lamp casting shadows across her face, and trace his handwriting with her fingers. His words brought comfort at first, like a balm to the ache of his absence. But as the letters grew more distant, not in frequency but in tone, something began to shift in her heart. She told herself it was just her imagination, that Hugo's love hadn't changed. But doubt crept in, quiet and insidious, like water finding cracks in a stone. Her days in the village felt longer without him. The routine of chores and solitude wore on her, and though she kept busy, the weight of his absence pressed heavily on her chest. Sometimes late at night she'd stare at the pendant he'd given her, clutched tightly in her hand, and wonder, would the man she loved still be the same when he returned? Hugo didn't notice it happening at first, the way the camaraderie with his unit began to take root in his life. The men he served with, Sergei, Pavel, and Victor, became like brothers to him, their shared struggles binding them in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was Sergei who first floated the idea of starting a business together after their service ended. "We're good at fixing things," he'd said one evening, fiddling with a broken radio. "Why not make a living out of it?" The others chimed in, their voices filled with excitement and hope. Hugo couldn't help but get swept up in their enthusiasm. They'd sketch out plans during their rare moments of downtime, dreaming of a future where they could be their own bosses. For the first time since leaving Rosalia, Hugo felt like he had something tangible to hold on to, something to look forward to beyond the endless cycle of drills and marches. But every time he let himself dream of the future, Rosalia's face would rise in his mind, unbidden. He could see her, sitting under the oak tree back in the village, her hair catching the sunlight, her smile the only thing he'd ever truly needed. Valeria came into his life like a storm. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention without trying, her sharp green eyes seeming to see straight through a person. She was the daughter of a general, her name whispered with equal parts admiration and wariness among the men. Hugo first met her at a gathering his unit attended, an event meant to boost morale, but filled with stiff conversations and half-hearted toasts. Valeria had approached him directly, her confidence disarming. "You're not from around here," she'd said, tilting her head as though studying him. "No, ma'am," Hugo had replied, awkwardly polite. "Don't call me ma'am," she'd laughed. "It makes me feel ancient." She was charming in her way and persistent. Over time, she began to insert herself into his life, offering small favors here and there, an introduction to someone who could help his budding business, a quiet word to her father to smooth over bureaucratic hurdles. Hugo didn't mean to let her in. At first, he justified it to himself. She was a connection, a stepping stone to a future where he and Rosalia could have everything they'd ever dreamed of. But Valeria wasn't the type to be a mere stepping stone. She was the storm, and Hugo found himself caught in her pull before he even realized it. He still wrote to Rosalia, but his letters became vaguer, the promises less certain. He told himself it was temporary, that he was doing all of this for her, for them. But deep down, he knew he was drifting, and the guilt gnawed at him. Valeria, of course, wasn't blind to the situation. She knew about Rosalia. She didn't bring it up directly, not at first, but there was a possessiveness in her actions that spoke volumes. She wanted Hugo, not just as a business partner or a companion, but as something more permanent. "You have potential, Hugo," she told him one evening, her voice low and persuasive. "But you can't live with one foot in the past. The future is here, waiting for you. You just have to take it." Hugo nodded, though a part of him rebelled at the thought. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, but he convinced himself he could control it. He would take what he needed from this new life and then go back to Rosalia, as though nothing had changed. But Valeria wasn't a woman to be used and discarded. She saw through him, her green eyes narrowing with a mix of calculation and anger. Valeria's hands hovered over the crisp white stationery, her pen poised as if savoring the weight of what she was about to do. She didn't rush. Valeria was never one to act without precision. She wanted her words to cut deep, to leave no room for doubt. Rosalia needed to know the truth, or at least Valeria's version of it. "Dear Rosalia," she began, her handwriting elegant and deliberate, "I hope this letter finds you well. You don't know me, but I feel it's my duty to tell you something that Hugo has likely kept from you. You see, we're married now." She paused, tilting her head as she considered her next line. The photograph lay beside her, a glossy reminder of the day she'd planned meticulously, not for love, but for power. Valeria tapped her pen against the table before continuing. "It was a beautiful ceremony. Hugo looked dashing in his uniform, and I wore a dress I think you would have appreciated. Simple but elegant. Enclosed is a picture, so you don't think I'm writing this out of spite or jealousy. I simply believe in honesty, and I thought you deserved to know." Her lips curled into a satisfied smile as she slipped the photograph into the envelope. The image showed Hugo standing stiffly beside her, his face unreadable, while Valeria beamed like the cat who had swallowed the canary. She sealed the letter and handed it off to her assistant, her instructions clear: deliver it quickly and directly to Rosalia. Valeria sat back, savoring the small victory. Rosalia was a loose thread, a distraction Hugo couldn't seem to let go of. And Valeria hated loose threads. The letter arrived 3 days later, and Rosalia didn't recognize the handwriting at first. She opened it cautiously, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the paper. The words hit her like a physical blow. "Married?" she whispered, disbelief cracking her voice. Her eyes darted to the photograph, and for a moment she thought it must be a cruel joke. But there he was. Hugo. Her Hugo. Standing beside another woman, his arms stiffly placed at her waist. Her knees buckled, and she sank into the nearest chair, clutching the letter as though it might vanish if she let go. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. How could he? After everything they'd promised each other, after the letters, the pendant, the dreams they'd woven together like a tapestry. The hours passed in a blur of tears and unanswered questions. By nightfall, something inside her hardened. She couldn't let herself crumble, not again. She folded the letter neatly, placed it back in its envelope, and set it aside. When Rosalia sat down to write, her hands were steady, her words measured. "Dear Hugo," she began, "I hope this letter reaches you in good health. I wanted to let you know that I've moved on with my life, and I'm happy now. I've met someone kind and dependable, and we've been married for a while. I'm writing to tell you this because I believe it's best for both of us to let go of the past. I wish you and Valeria all the happiness in the world." She stared at the page for a long time after finishing, her chest tight, but her resolve firm. It was a lie, but a necessary one. Hugo needed to believe she was gone, unreachable. It was the only way she could protect herself from further heartbreak. Hugo sat at his desk late one evening, nursing a glass of whiskey as he sifted through his mail. His eyes fell on the letter from Rosalia, and his heart leapt with both excitement and dread. He tore it open hastily, the anticipation almost too much to bear. The words blurred together as he read them, disbelief twisting into anguish. "Married?" he muttered, his voice cracking on the word. His hands trembled as he gripped the letter, reading it again and again, hoping he'd misunderstood. The whiskey burned as he swallowed it down in one gulp, his mind reeling. How could she? After everything they'd shared, after all the nights he'd spent dreaming of her smile, her laugh, the way her hair caught the light in the summer sun. It felt like a betrayal, though he knew deep down it wasn't. Valeria found him there hours later, slumped over the desk, the empty bottle beside him. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch calculated. "Bad news?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Hugo shrugged her off, his head pounding from both the alcohol and the heartbreak. "It's nothing," he muttered, though the raw edge in his voice betrayed him. Valeria didn't press further, but the gleam in her eyes betrayed her satisfaction. Rosalia was out of the picture now, just as she had planned. The weeks that followed were a haze for Hugo. He threw himself into his work, trying to drown the ache in productivity. But the nights were the worst, when the silence closed in around him and the memory of Rosalia's laughter haunted him like a ghost. Valeria, ever watchful, tightened her grip. She orchestrated meetings, made decisions on his behalf, and positioned herself as indispensable. Hugo didn't fight her. He didn't have the strength. He found solace in the bottle, the whiskey dulling the edges of his pain. It wasn't long before Valeria used his spiraling to her advantage, convincing him to sign over more and more of their shared assets into her name. She cloaked her manipulation in the guise of care, but Hugo was too lost to notice. Or maybe he just didn't care anymore. Their home, once a place of promise and ambition, had become a battlefield of cold silences and unspoken resentments. Valeria moved through the house like a ghost. Her presence felt even when she wasn't there. The tension worsened as time wore on. Their inability to have children became a festering wound neither of them could ignore. For Valeria, it was a mark of failure she refused to carry alone. "You could see a doctor," she snapped one evening, her words cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Unless you're too proud to admit that the problem might be you." Hugo's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "I'm not doing this with you, Valeria," he said, his voice low and strained. "No, you never want to do this," she retorted, her eyes blazing. "You just want to hide in your office or drown yourself in whiskey. Do you think that fixes anything?" "Do you think you fix anything?" he shot back, standing abruptly. For a moment, they stared at each other, the weight of their mutual contempt filling the room. Then, Valeria turned on her heel and left, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Hugo sank back into his chair, the fight draining out of him almost as quickly as it had come. He stared at the empty whiskey glass on the table, his reflection warped in the amber-stained surface. Valeria's ambitions only grew sharper in the face of their deteriorating marriage. The company was thriving, a fact she relished even as Hugo retreated further into himself. But Valeria didn't see a partnership. She saw a prize. Her father's death had left her with a taste for absolute control. The fortune he left behind was substantial, but it wasn't enough. Not when Hugo still held the reins to their joint assets. She needed it all. She began weaving her web carefully, enlisting the help of a select few whose loyalty she could buy. A financial advisor here, a lawyer there. She learned to smile when she wanted to scream, to feign affection when all she felt was contempt. Hugo, oblivious to the storm brewing around him, buried himself in work whenever he wasn't drinking. The office became his refuge, a place where he could pretend, at least for a few hours, that his life hadn't spiraled into this unrecognizable mess. But even there, Valeria's shadow loomed. She'd appear unannounced, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors as she leaned casually against his desk. "You've been quiet lately," she remarked one afternoon, her tone deceptively light. "Should I be worried?" Hugo didn't look up from his papers. "What is it you want, Valeria?" "Only to make sure you're all right," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You don't have to check on me," he said, his voice flat. "I'm fine." Valeria lingered a moment longer before leaving, her presence lingering like a bad memory. Hugo woke slowly, his head pounding and his mouth dry as dust. His arms felt heavy, pinned awkwardly behind him, and his legs were numb from what must have been hours of immobility. He blinked into the darkness, his vision blurred, his thoughts sluggish. There was something wrong, something terribly wrong. But his mind couldn't quite piece it together yet. The last thing he remembered was Valeria, her voice soft and syrupy, coaxing him into another drink. "You need to relax, Hugo," she'd said, her smile disarming. "Everything's going to be just fine." He hadn't noticed the bitterness in the whiskey. The sound of voices filtered through the fog in his head, faint but distinct. He strained to listen, panic surging as the memories came flooding back. Valeria. The endless papers she'd pushed in front of him, the slow erosion of his independence, the bitterness he'd ignored. His hands tugged against the bindings at his wrists, rough rope biting into his skin. He was lying on something hard, uneven, the scent of damp earth filling his nose. The cold realization hit him. He wasn't in his home, or even anywhere near it. He tried to call out, but his voice was hoarse, weak. All he could manage was a strained groan that barely escaped his throat. Valeria, meanwhile, stood at the center of the grand hall where the funeral was being held. She wore black, elegant but understated, her expression carefully crafted to appear grief-stricken. She played the part of the devastated widow with precision, accepting murmured condolences with downcast eyes and trembling hands. "It was so sudden," she whispered to an elderly guest, dabbing the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief. "He'd been under so much stress, you know. I told him to take it easy, but—" She let the sentence trail off, her voice breaking just enough to seem genuine. The ornate coffin stood at the front of the room, a centerpiece to her performance. It was closed, of course. She'd ensured it would remain that way. But Valeria had miscalculated. The pallbearers were young and inexperienced, their footing uncertain as they carried the heavy coffin toward the waiting hearse. One misstep, a stumble on the uneven ground outside the hall, and the coffin slipped from their grip. It hit the ground with a sickening thud, the sound reverberating through the air. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the lid cracked open slightly, enough for something to spill out, grainy and pale like sand. "Is that dirt?" someone whispered, their voice tinged with confusion and fear. The murmurs grew louder, the crowd pressing closer despite themselves. A braver soul stepped forward, tugging at the lid with shaking hands. When it opened fully, the collective gasp was deafening. There was no body inside, just sand. Valeria's composure faltered for the first time, her hand tightening around the strap of her purse. Her mind raced as she tried to assess the situation, her polished facade slipping. This must be some kind of mistake," she stammered, though her voice lacked conviction. The whispers turned to murmurs, the murmurs to shouts. People began questioning, speculating, and Valeria knew she couldn't stay there. She slipped away from the chaos, her heels clicking against the pavement as she hurried to her car. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, but once she was inside, she let out a sharp breath. "It doesn't matter," she muttered to herself, her grip on the wheel tightening. "It's too late for him anyway." But Valeria had underestimated Hugo once again. Deep in the graveyard, Hugo heard the commotion. The muffled sounds of shouting filtered through the layers of dirt and wood above him. He struggled harder against the ropes, adrenaline coursing through him. He kicked at the sides of the pit, his movements frantic, the bindings cutting deeper into his skin. A sharp crack sounded above him, the unmistakable noise of wood splitting. The coffin's collapse had caused a shift in the ground above. Light pierced through the cracks, followed by a rush of cool air. Hugo coughed, the sudden change jarring his senses. "Help!" he croaked, his voice hoarse but louder now. "Somebody! Help me!" The noise caught the attention of one of the cemetery workers who had come to investigate the commotion. He froze when he heard the faint cry, his eyes wide with disbelief. Is someone down there?" "Yes." Hugo's voice broke with desperation. "I'm here. Get me out." It didn't take long for others to gather, tools in hand, as they worked frantically to uncover him. When they finally pulled Hugo from the ground, his face was pale, his wrists raw and bleeding, but his eyes burned with something fierce and unrelenting. Valeria's name was on his lips before he even caught his breath. By the time Hugo returned home, Valeria was gone. She'd fled, leaving behind the house, the company, and everything she couldn't carry. It didn't surprise him. Valeria wasn't the type to stick around when the game was up. Hugo sat in the quiet of his office that night, staring at the papers she'd tricked him into signing. He could see her fingerprints on every corner of his life, the calculated precision with which she'd tried to erase him. But she hadn't won, not entirely. In the days that followed, Hugo didn't speak of her to anyone. When the authorities came asking questions, he waved them off. He didn't have the energy for revenge, nor did he want to waste another moment of his life on her schemes. Instead, he packed a small bag and left the city behind. The road back to the village stretched long and winding before him, but it was the only place left where he might find peace. The bus rattled down the narrow country road, kicking up dust as it wound through familiar hills and fields. Hugo sat by the window, his gaze distant, the hum of the engine blending with the murmur of passengers behind him. He hadn't been back to the village in 15 years, yet every curve of the road tugged at something buried deep within him. When the bus rounded a bend, Hugo's chest tightened. A figure stood by the side of the road, head tilted as though lost in thought. The sunlight caught her hair, a shade of honey blonde he knew too well, and, for a moment, time seemed to fold in on itself. Rosalia, he whispered, the name barely audible over the noise of the bus. He didn't think. His body moved on instinct. He grabbed his bag and made his way to the front, waving at the driver. "Stop here, please." The driver frowned but pulled over, muttering something about city folk and their whims. Hugo barely noticed, his focus fixed on the woman outside. Rosalia was staring at the field beyond the road, her thoughts drifting like the breeze that stirred the tall grass. She didn't hear the bus at first, nor did she notice the figure approaching until his voice broke through her reverie. "Rosalia?" She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. The man before her looked older, his face more weathered, his shoulders carrying an invisible weight. But the eyes, the deep, dark eyes she'd once loved, were unmistakable. "Hugo?" He nodded, his lips twitching into a hesitant smile. Neither of them moved at first, as though the years between them had frozen them in place. Then, all at once, Rosalia stepped forward, her arms wrapping around him in a gesture that was both cautious and desperate. Hugo held her just as tightly, burying his face in her shoulder, the scent of her hair stirring memories he thought he'd buried forever. "I can't believe it's you," she murmured, her voice trembling. "I'm back," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. They found a quiet spot beneath the old oak tree by the stream, the same place they used to meet when they were young. The years had changed the landscape a little. The stream was narrower and the tree's branches hung lower, but the air held the same sense of peace. Rosalia sat on the grass, her hands folded in her lap, while Hugo leaned against the tree, watching her. 15 years, she said softly, breaking the silence. "That's a long time to be gone, Hugo." He nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I know. I thought about coming back so many times, but life kept pulling me further away." Rosalia glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "And what brought you back now?" Hugo hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I needed to. I needed to leave the city, leave everything behind. And I wanted to see you. I didn't think you'd still be here." She smiled faintly, a touch of sadness in her eyes. "I told you I'd never leave the village. It's the only place that's ever felt like home." There was a long pause before Hugo spoke again. "And Your husband? Is he here? Rosalia's head tilted slightly, a small crease forming between her brows. Husband? Hugo looked up, confused. You wrote to me, Rosalia. You said you'd married and were happy. Her shoulders tensed, and she looked away. I lied, Hugo, she admitted quietly. I thought it would make things easier. For both of us. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of her words settling between them. You never married? Hugo asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Rosalia shook her head. No. I didn't want to. Hugo felt something stir in his chest, a spark of hope he hadn't dared to feel in years. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Rosalia, Don't, she interrupted, her voice trembling. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Don't say anything you can't promise, Hugo. Not again. He nodded, swallowing hard. I just want to be here, Rosalia. Whatever that means. Whatever you'll let it mean. She studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. Come to the house. It's not much, but it's home. Hugo sat in Rosalia's modest kitchen, his hands curled around a warm cup of tea, the tension in his chest loosening with every passing moment. The room was simple but inviting, filled with the faint scent of herbs hanging from the rafters and the creak of the wooden floor beneath his chair. It was a place that felt lived in, untouched by the chaos and pretension of the city. As Rosalia tidied up near the counter, Hugo's gaze wandered across the room. His eyes fell on a small wooden box sitting on a shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of neatly folded linens. Something about it tugged at his attention, though he couldn't say why. What's that? He asked, nodding toward it. Rosalia turned, her face briefly shadowed by a flicker of hesitation. Just an old box, she said, brushing it off lightly. Memories I couldn't throw away. Her tone was casual, but there was something guarded in her eyes. Hugo hesitated before standing, his curiosity getting the better of him. May I? She didn't answer immediately, but after a moment she nodded. I suppose it's time you saw, she murmured, her voice tinged with something between resignation and relief. Inside the box, Hugo found a neatly folded letter and a photograph. He recognized Valeria's handwriting on the envelope before he even unfolded the paper. His heart sank as he pulled it out, the words written in her cold, calculating style, instantly stirring a bitter taste in his mouth. I thought you should know the truth about Hugo, the letter began. As he read, Hugo felt the walls closing in around him. Valeria's words were poison, designed to wound, to manipulate. She had written to Rosalia after their marriage, detailing every lie, every betrayal she could muster. And then there was the photograph, his wedding photo with Valeria, the one Rosalia had seen all those years ago. Hugo's hands trembled as he set the letter and photo back into the box. He turned to Rosalia, who was leaning against the counter, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. You kept this, he said, his voice low, almost breaking. How could I not? She replied, her tone sharper than she intended. It's what I had left of you, Hugo. Proof of what I thought you'd become. He shook his head, his eyes clouded with regret. Rosalia, I didn't know. Valeria, she was cruel, and I let her control too much. But I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you. She studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. Finally, she let out a slow breath. I believe you, she said quietly. But that doesn't erase what happened. The sound of the front door creaking open broke the heavy silence between them. Rosalia turned, a soft smile breaking across her face, as a boy stepped inside, holding a fishing rod and a bucket that sloshed with water. "Did you catch anything?" she asked, her tone warm and maternal. The boy, about 15, grinned and held up the bucket. "A couple. Big ones, too. I'll clean 'em out back." Hugo froze, the words catching in his throat. The boy was tall and lanky, with a mop of dark hair that fell into his eyes, and a smile that sent a jolt through Hugo's chest. It was like looking into a mirror of his younger self. "Who's this?" the boy asked, glancing at Hugo curiously. "This is Hugo," Rosalia said, her voice steady but soft. "An old friend?" The boy nodded politely, though he gave Hugo one last curious look before heading back out the door. Hugo turned to Rosalia, his expression one of shock and confusion. "He looks like you?" Rosalia finished for him. His breath hitched. "Rosalia, is he—" She didn't answer right away, her eyes dropping to the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, Hugo. He's your son." The weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave. He sank back into his chair, his mind racing. "You didn't tell me," he said, the hurt clear in his voice. "I couldn't," she replied, her voice cracking. "When I found out, you were already gone, and then there was the letter, the picture. What was I supposed to do? Bring a child into that mess? I had to protect him, Hugo." His hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "I would have come back. If I'd known, Rosalia, I would have come back." She looked at him then, her eyes filled with tears. "Would you?" The question hung between them, heavy with years of pain and missed chances. Later that evening, after the boy, Misha, had gone to bed, Hugo sat with Rosalia on the porch, the night air cool and still. "I can't make up for the years I missed," he said quietly. "But I want to try, Rosalia. I want to be here for him. For you. Whatever it takes." She looked at him, her expression softening. "Misha doesn't know the whole story. He just knows you weren't here. If you want to be a part of his life, Hugo, you'll have to show him who you really are." He nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I will. I'll prove it to both of you." Snow began to fall softly outside, blanketing the village in white as Christmas approached. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and the distant sound of carolers from the church down the road. Hugo stood by the window of Rosalia's small cottage, his breath fogging the glass, as he watched Misha and a few other boys building a snowman near the edge of the yard. Misha's laughter rang out, clear and carefree, and for a moment Hugo felt an ache deep in his chest. That sound. It was something he'd missed for too many years. "He's good with the other kids," Rosalia said, her voice pulling Hugo's attention back inside. She was sitting at the table, wrapping small gifts in simple brown paper, her hands deftly tying twine bows. Hugo nodded. "He's got your spirit," he said, turning toward her. "That way of making people feel at ease, like they've always belonged." Rosalia glanced up, her expression softening, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "He's had to grow up without a lot of things other boys have," she said. "But he's strong, stronger than I was at his age." Hugo moved closer, leaning against the table as he watched her work. "You gave him what he needed, Rosalia. Love, safety, a home. That's more than enough." She paused, her fingers lingering over the ribbon in her hand. "And now?" she asked quietly. "What are you giving him, Hugo?" Her words weren't harsh, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Hugo straightened, taking a deep breath. "I'm giving him me." Whatever that looks like, however long it takes for him to trust that I'm not going anywhere this time." Rosalia looked at him for a long moment before nodding, satisfied. "Good," she said softly. The village Christmas Eve celebration was simple but heartfelt, held in the small square near the church. A towering tree stood in the center, adorned with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the gathered crowd, their laughter and chatter filling the chilly air. Hugo stood off to the side, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets as he watched Misha dart between the groups of villagers, showing off the wooden sled he'd carved with Rosalia's help. "You made it through the whole day without retreating to a corner," Rosalia teased as she joined him, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Just barely," Hugo admitted with a small laugh. "I forgot how much energy these village gatherings have. It's different from the city," she smiled. "Different good? Different perfect," he said, his voice quiet but steady. For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, watching as the children took turns sliding down the hill behind the church. The warmth of the moment wrapped around Hugo, and he found himself speaking before he'd fully thought it through. "I was thinking," he began, his voice hesitant, "about making this official. Us, I mean." Rosalia turned to him, her brows lifting slightly in surprise. "I know it's not the same as it was back then," Hugo continued quickly. "But I don't want to wait any longer. Not after everything we've been through. I want to build something real with you, Rosalia. For us and for Misha." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Finally, she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Hugo Reyes," she said, her voice full of warmth. "You really know how to catch a girl off guard." "Is that a yes?" he asked, his voice tinged with hope. "It's we'll see, for now," she teased, though the smile on her face told him everything he needed to know. Christmas morning dawned quietly, the soft light of the rising sun casting a golden glow over the snow-covered village. Rosalia had risen early to prepare breakfast, the smell of freshly baked bread and warm tea filling the cottage. Misha sat on the floor near the small tree in the corner, his excitement barely contained as he opened the gifts that Rosalia and Hugo had wrapped the night before. Hugo handed him a small, neatly wrapped box. "This one's from me," he said, his voice steady but tinged with nerves. Misha tore into the paper, his eyes widening as he pulled out a polished pocket knife with his initials engraved on the handle. "For the next sled we build together," Hugo said, kneeling beside him. Misha looked at the knife, then up at Hugo, his face a mixture of surprise and cautious gratitude. "Thanks," he said simply, but the weight behind the word wasn't lost on Hugo. Rosalia watched from the kitchen, her heart full as she saw the small but significant step between father and son. Later that evening, after the day's festivities had settled and Misha had gone to bed, Hugo and Rosalia sat together by the fire. "You made an impression on him," Rosalia said, her voice quiet. "I'm trying," Hugo replied. "He's a good kid. He deserves the best I can give him." She reached over, placing her hand on his. "We both do," she said softly. Hugo turned to her, his eyes steady. "And you'll have it." "I promise, Rosalia." This time she didn't pull away. Instead, she let his hand linger in hers as they sat in the glow of the fire, the quiet peace of the holiday wrapping around them like a gift neither had expected, but both desperately needed. The story of Hugo and Rosalia is a poignant journey of love, loss, and redemption, woven with the complexities of human emotion and the enduring power of hope. Hugo's path is marked by mistakes and betrayal, but also by his relentless desire to rebuild what was broken. His transformation from a man lost in the chaos of ambition and manipulation to someone who values family and connection speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. Rosalia's strength is equally inspiring. Despite heartbreak and abandonment, she chooses forgiveness over bitterness, crafting a life of quiet dignity and care for her son. Her ability to welcome Hugo back into her life shows not weakness, but the courage to heal and move forward. The reunion of this fractured family and their gradual steps toward rebuilding trust serve as a powerful reminder that redemption is possible, but it requires humility, effort, and sincerity. The story teaches us that love is not merely an emotion, but a commitment to understanding, patience, and growth. Ultimately, Hugo and Rosalia's journey reflects the universal truth that, even in the face of life's harshest trials, it is never too late to mend what has been broken and find meaning in shared hope and love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.